Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar on how to start a business in Singapore. I'm Sahana and I'll be with you throughout today's webinar. I'm a client relationship manager with Osome and I've successfully helped hundreds of entrepreneurs and business owners launch their businesses in Singapore. I hope to keep this webinar as informative as possible, but short at the same time. For now, sit back and relax and check out our agenda on your screen. If you have any questions, please feel free to chat with our friendly agents through the chat at my.osome.com. Alright, let's dive right in. The first thing on most people's mind when expanding or starting a new company is, where do I go? So why Singapore then? Simple. The laws and regulations in Singapore is transparent and it is also a great place to live. However, the most important reason is that the taxes in Singapore is lower than most countries and Singapore strives to be a hub in many areas and is already known as a financial, business, technology, trading hub in Southeast Asia. Expanding on what I mentioned earlier, besides being transparent, Singapore is also pro-business and shareholdings of companies in Singapore can be fully owned by foreigners. Same laws apply to both local and foreign companies. The only difference is that there must be at least one local resident director in every Singapore company. Continuing on the pro-business stand, Singapore has a favorable tax system. So there are two types of tax systems, the one-tier tax system and the two-tier tax system. Singapore follows a one-tier tax system where the corporate tax on net profit of the company is the only tax charged. However, under the two-tier tax system, there is a tax on dividend distribution by the company in addition to the corporate tax on net profits. The corporate tax rate in Singapore is 17% and the maximum personal tax rate is 22%. There's also a 0% tax on dividends and capital gains. In addition to the above, there are tax exemptions for startups as well, which makes the effective tax rate even lower. If you look at the comparison on the screen, we have taken an example of a company making a profit of Sing dollar 100,000, that is 50 lakh Indian rupees approximately. If the company was incorporated in India, they would have to pay an additional tax of 14 lakhs 8,500 Indian rupees in India when compared to Singapore. Isn't this reason enough to incorporate your company in Singapore? In addition to lower taxes, there's also tax exemption available in Singapore for up to the first 200,000 of taxable income for the first 3 years after incorporation, except for investment holding companies. There is a 75% exemption on the first 100,000 of profit and 50% exemption on the next 100,000 of profit for startup companies. So the effective tax rate on the first 100,000 profit for the first 3 years is 4.25%. After the first 3 years, there are exemptions, but it's not as good as the first 3 years. There is a 75% exemption on the first $10,000 of profits and 50% exemption on the next $190,000 of profit. This gives an effective tax rate of about 8.08% on, for example, $100,000 of profit. Singapore is a great place to live. With its vast Indian population and proximity to India, it has the best infrastructure, safe environment, and almost zero rate of corruption. Simple immigration laws. If you have the experience, a good resume, qualification, and a convincing business plan, the employment pass approval is possible. While there are a lot of positives, there will be negatives of such a great place for doing business. Because a lot of entrepreneurs want to set up a company here in Singapore, competition is stiff, and although transparent, the laws are strict. Singapore has also been featuring in the list of world's most expensive cities to live in, and in fact has been listed as the number one most expensive city for the last 5 years by the Economist Intelligence Unit. We've looked at why Singapore, simple rules here, lower taxes, and a great place to live. Hopefully by now, most if not all are convinced that Singapore is a great place to start a business. But then you start to ask, how do I incorporate a company in Singapore? What are the requirements, processes, and how much will it cost me? Before we head there, I think it's important to introduce you to ACRA, or the Accounting and Corporate Regulatory Authority. It is the regulatory body that ensures that all companies incorporated in Singapore complies with the regulatory requirements. It's also ACRA that decides whether the company can be incorporated or not. Moving on, the requirements are simple. The documents required are just passports and address proofs of all shareholders. And in the case of a corporate shareholder, we would require the certificate of incorporation, certificate of incumbency, and the memorandum and articles of association of the corporate shareholder. Company name. The first step in incorporating a company in Singapore is to decide on the name. The name must be unique and must not contain any undesirable words. Nominee director. As mentioned earlier, to incorporate a company here, you need a nominee director who is a Singaporean or a permanent resident. A nominee director ensures that the company complies with all the regulatory requirements of ACRA and does not get involved in the day-to-day operations of the business and has no share in the profits of the company. Company secretary. A company secretary is again an officer of the company who is responsible to ensure that the company complies with the regulatory requirements of ACRA. Registered office address. All companies incorporated in Singapore need to have a registered office address. You do not need to have an office here. You can just use a virtual office address. Initial capital. We can incorporate a company in Singapore with a minimum share capital of Sing dollar 1. However, if you wish to apply for an employment pass visa and move to Singapore, you'll need a higher share capital. The whole incorporation process would look somewhat like this. We would need to ensure that the name is available and then gather the documents as mentioned earlier, do the necessary due diligence and send the documents to the shareholders and directors for signature. Once the required documents are signed, the company can be incorporated. The whole process could take as little as a few hours, depending on the complexity of the structure of the company. The costs for our services can be seen here, and if you notice, the bulk of the fee comes from having to appoint a nominee director. So if you do know someone whom you can trust in Singapore, who is a Singaporean or a Singapore PR, you could appoint him or her as the local resident director of the company. If you have the intention to apply for the employment pass, which is a form of work visa in Singapore, once you obtain it, you would also qualify as the local resident director. We've seen the requirements, process, and cost of incorporation in the previous slides. Let's move to how you can move to Singapore, the visa requirements, etc. The most straightforward option to move to Singapore is to apply for an employment pass, and I will be going through the requirements and process for that. So, why the employment pass? Most work visas in Singapore requires a quota. Unlike the employment pass, and it is most applicable for executives in the company. Compared to some of the other work visas, the requirements are less complicated, and once approved, it can be valid for up to a year, and then the renewal is approved for 2 years. It allows you to bring in your dependents and also gives you an option to eventually apply for permanent residentship. The salary requirements for your employment pass is based on your qualification, experience, and the business plan. If you want to bring in dependents, example spouse and children, there's a minimum salary requirement of 6,000 per month. If you want to bring in your parents, it's 12,000 Sing dollars per month. The requirements for employment pass application is your updated resume, educational certificate, detailed business plan of the company, list of potential investors, contracts with customers and suppliers if any. The process is relatively straightforward. After incorporating the company, you would need to gather and provide the information and documents for the employment pass application, and upon submission of the application, it would take anywhere from 3 to 6 months before it's approved, and if you are bringing your family to Singapore, you can then apply for their dependent pass. Now, it ain't all rainbows and unicorns throughout every process. There are hiccups that can happen at any juncture. For example, the desired name could be taken, individuals in the company could be rejected by the authorities, bank account opening might be rejected, and the list goes on. Therefore, it's important to know what can go wrong and plan contingencies for them. In relation to the name of the company, if there is an existing company with the same name or if the name is considered undesirable, ACRA will reject the name. We can either appeal for the name and wait for approval, which takes about 14 days, or just come up with a new name, which is the best option. Sometimes ACRA might reject certain individuals in the company and cause the incorporation to be delayed because the individual failed to clear the due diligence. But it may be appealed against if there are reasons to support the appeal. Same goes on for the banks. If the overseas bank accounts of the individual shareholders are not clean, bank may reject the application. It's important to ensure overseas credibility record and bank accounts is clean. Delays in employment pass application may happen too, and it is relatively common with varying reasons, but it isn't the most crucial as you can still run the business remotely or travel to Singapore and speak to clients on a travel visa. But there are certain activities that you cannot do without a valid work pass. As we all know, Singapore is not the cheapest place to live in, and as mentioned earlier, Singapore has been listed as the number one most expensive city to live in for 5 years straight. You can check the details of living and business cost on this slide. Last but not the least, now that you have an overview of how great a place Singapore is to do business and the process for incorporating a company in Singapore and even moving to Singapore, the next question would be, where do I start and how can we help? At Osome, we offer 24/7 free consultations for all we have discussed earlier in this webinar and more, all through our bot and the app. And with that, there is absolutely no need for you to travel to Singapore to incorporate a company, although to open a bank account, you might still need to travel to Singapore. We offer all services in relation to incorporation and even services that you may require to run your business. All you need to do is ask us. We also provide assistance in opening bank accounts with one of the most reputable banks in Singapore, OCBC. With the convenience and our affordable rates, there's no need to look further should you want to incorporate your company in Singapore. This wraps up my webinar for today, and again, you can always reach us at my.osome.com. Thank you.